Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Carla Legria, the project manager with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Today's webinar from our core curriculum on creating accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed services, a capacity building training for domestic violence and sexual assault programs. This will be an overview of Module 7 on trauma-informed advocacy and substance use, and presented by Gabriela Zapata-Alma. Before we get started, I would like to go over some of the technical details of the WebEx software that we'll be using for today's webinar. Please be aware that your screen might look a little different depending on whether you're using a Mac or PC. On the right-hand side of your screen, there are a few boxes. Towards the bottom is the chat feature. You may have to click on the chat icon at the bottom right of your screen to open your chat box. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your fellow colleagues, as well as get in contact with the presenter if you have questions regarding the training content. You may contact me if you have any questions troubleshooting the WebEx software. To do this, click the down-facing arrow and select the person you would like to contact. You'll see a lot of options, but for this session, you'll want to select everyone. If you would like to respond to a question from the presenter or to contact center staff at any time during this session. So let's test this chat feature. Will everyone please go to the chat box, click on everyone, type in where you're calling from, and then press enter. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you all very much. While you get a lot out of this chat feature, there are times when it moves really quickly and can feel a little distracting. If this is true for you, feel free to minimize the chat box by clicking the arrow next to where it says chat. You can always open it again with the same arrow if you choose. We will be providing live captioning during this webinar. Below the chat box, there's a multimedia viewer box. This will contain the captions. If you do not want to see the captions, click on the down-facing arrow next to the word Multimedia Viewer, the same way you might if you want to hide the chat box. Time permitting, we'll moderate a Q&A towards the end via the chat box, and at the very end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a brief survey. Please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected at any point, return to the email you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. Sometimes the sound cuts out due to internet connection, so feel free to call back if that is a problem for you. If you are experiencing technical difficulties and are unable to contact me, please reach out to the WebEx tech support to resolve any issues. That number, which I'll post in the chat box, is 1-866-229-3239. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I'll now turn it over to Gabriela.
Thank you so much, Carla, and thanks everyone for being here with us today for the final session in what's been a series on our updated core curriculum on creating accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed services. If you weren't able to attend any of the previous sessions, or you want to just share them with colleagues, friends, and other folks in your circle, or you want to review any of them, they are all available fully accessible on our website in our webinar library. So in this session, we're going to offer an overview of the final module in our core curriculum. And the final module builds on all of the information of the previous modules of, how to be present with folks and support them in emotional safety planning, in helping to navigate emotional distress, being able to create that emotional safety and support folks as people very, very naturally experience different fear responses. So this is, building on everything we've talked about so far, and that's why it's the last one in our series. So this slide just talks a little more about our center, but I know that in previous sessions, Kathy did an awesome job of, describing our center, introducing our center. So I'm going to go ahead and skip it for time's sake because there is a lot in Module 7 in our substance use module. So the main topics are first, uncovering, making clear the relationship between domestic violence, sexual violence, trauma, and substance use. And this includes substance use coercion. Then talking about substance use and recovery. What does that even mean, right? What are we even talking about when we're talking about someone's substance use or their recovery? Then goes into practical strategies for supporting survivors. And these are strategies that can be really helpful even when there's not substance use at play, but they are specifically tailored for supporting survivors with a substance use history, either former or present. And then, of course, the policy environment, thinking about our program policies that make these practices possible. And finally, included in this module is information on preventing and responding to overdose, including providing overdose prevention, education, and safety planning with survivors of domestic and sexual violence. The really, really tragic reality is that we are continuing to experience escalating lives lost due to overdoses, accidental overdoses. And so this becomes really something that we need all hands on deck to really prevent unnecessary death. And also because survivors are at increased risk of accidental overdose. But first, I want to invite everyone to think of a situation that involves a survivor of a family and involves substance use and feels particularly challenging. And I want to invite everyone to go ahead and jot some notes down to yourself about that situation, about what makes it challenging. And we'll come back to this situation a few times in this session. And be sure to write it down to yourself privately. Don't put this in the chat box. Just, jot down some notes, either in like a notepad, a Word document, whatever you have handy. All right. So we're going to move forward with this situation in mind. And we're going to start with first reflective practice. That in order to offer any kind of support to somebody else, to be able to connect with somebody else, we need to be connected within ourselves, and that our own self-awareness is what really supports our ability to connect with other people in ways that are meaningful, that honor their dignity. And so here, some pieces for reflection. What experiences have influenced my views on substance use and people who use substances? So take a moment and you're welcome to put anything that you'd like to in the chat here in response to this reflection question. You don't have to, but you're welcome to. As you think about what has influenced your own views on substance use and people who use substances. And then now I'll invite everyone to go back to that challenging situation that you identified before. And what are some pieces of your own experience, personal and professional experiences, that contribute to you feeling challenged in that situation? So, as we continue to use our muscles around reflective practice, so much of what we are trying to do in creating truly accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma informed ways of having healing centered engagement with people who use substances, so much of it is clarifying these different pieces for ourselves. So now going into the relationship between domestic violence, sexual assault, sexual violence, trauma, and substance use. And so here I'd like to pause and just hear from all of you. What do you see as some of the intersections here? And we know that this intersects with so many other pieces of people's experience, including mental health. So, what are some of the intersections that you've noticed here? Trauma. Yes, trauma. The financial abuse. Yes. They all influence each other. As one increases, so do others. They're all connected. Coercive control, fear and control, power and control. Absolutely. So sometimes when we feel our own fear response coming up or our own kind of views on substance use coming up, sometimes that can raise some feelings of kind of discomfort for us. And then we can think, well, I'm not a substance use specialist, or, I need to get this person to someone who can really understand and help them around substance use. And the thing that we want to really center is that when people are with us, they're with us for a reason, right? And that our role is to be present, even when it's uncomfortable, to be present with them and to, create opportunities for them to have the space to think about what would be helpful. What do they want to have that's different? What do they want to keep that's the same? And how can we help them both support them as well as develop options and access different resources that maybe they are aware of or maybe they're not aware of, right? But just offering options that feel relevant and helpful, and that timing is a big part of that, right? The same resource at the wrong time can feel like someone's brushing me off versus someone is really hearing me, really responding to where I'm at and what I'm sharing with them. And so when substance use comes up, sometimes because of kind of the discomfort it might raise in us or in our programs, sometimes people who use substances unfortunately have the experience of kind of getting, judged or pushed away or told that they have to go somewhere else, right? And when we can truly understand the intersections between all of these different forms of violence and power and control and trauma and substance use, including substance use coercion, then we can start to understand that this person is actually exactly where they need to be. They don't need to go to see somebody else, right? Unless that's something that they choose for themselves. And then it would be in addition to, not instead of, our advocacy support. So the module provides some additional data points and information that's been kind of collected through, decades of hearing survivors, advocates, as well as the different research literature available. Um, And so, here just really uncovering again how being abused by an intimate partner, how domestic and sexual violence can have traumatic mental health and substance use effects. And it's really common. It's the overlap here is incredibly common. So if we are ever kind of coming across that anxiety response of, well, I can't deal with this. This person needs to go to a substance use specialist, understanding that this is part of the way that victimization this is part of the way that abuse impacts people, and that it's a really, really normal and natural response to abuse. And that what we really need to do is destigmatize our services and show up as advocates in that moment, right? Show up within our empowerment frameworks. Nothing in this module is about turning anyone into a substance use counselor, not by any means. Everything in this module is about showing up as an advocate within our empowerment and survivor-driven frameworks, and just not kind of losing sight of our deep roots in advocacy as soon as substance use comes into the picture, right? And so, one way that we can understand substance use within the context of just power and control and trauma is this framework. And the module provides some information, some resources on the power threat meaning framework, where what we are doing is we're looking at how power has impacted this person. What has been their access to power? What power have they been on the kind of lower end of it? They've been marginalized from or has been used against them, right? And then from there, how has the interaction of power dynamics created threats, both to themselves as an individual, to their family, to their community, even environmental threats? From there, what's the meaning? What is the story that people tell themselves? What's the meaning that they draw from these experiences, these harms? As well as what's the social discourse? Are we in a community that tends to engage in victim blaming? Or are we in a community that effectively understands that people are never to blame for the ways that they're harmed, that people are worthy of dignity and respect and safety no matter what, right? And along social discourse, are we in a community where there's high rates of stigma around substance use? Or are we in a community that has a more a more kind of human-centered view of substance use? So with all this in mind, we can start to contextualize how somebody is surviving in their moment, how they've gotten to this moment. And that substance use isn't just, while it absolutely can be a response, a reaction to violence, but it's also something that has very likely had some protective pieces in somebody's experience, right? And so I want you to go back to that initial situation, the one that you identified as being uniquely challenging, that involved survivors and substance use. And just take a moment to reflect on these reflection questions from the power threat meaning framework. So, first, what happened? How is power operating in this person's life? From there, what was the impact? What kind of threats does it pose? What sense do they make of it? What is the meaning of these experiences for them? And then, with all that in mind, what has helped them to survive? What kinds of threat responses are they using? And so, something that is very purposeful about this module is that this module is not about how to get people off of substances. That is not what this module is about, and that's not survivor driven, right? What this module is about is empathy, meeting people where they are, understanding people within their own situation, and then offering real support that is validating, that is healing, and that as people access the things that they need and want, including safety, we will see kind of those stabilizing effects around whatever substance use challenge they may be experiencing. So if you're somebody who is interested in facilitating this module, which is awesome, that's what our hope is, and we have video guides walking through them that you can, and written guides and all kinds of things that we're going to link in the chat at the end. But it'll be really interesting as you facilitate this module when people in the room start noticing, oh, wait, we're not talking about how to get someone to stop. Because we need to be as advocates, we need to be the radical opposite of that power and control that survivors have been subjected to. We need to be the radical opposite to that. So when people in the room notice, oh, this isn't about getting survivors to stop. This is about empowerment. This is about meeting people where they are. This is about safety planning. This is about advocacy, right? Some other things we talk about in the module is, while we recognize that violence impacts people of all genders, including our gender nonconforming and non-binary relatives, that women often are disproportionately impacted by violence. And when we say women, that includes trans and cisgender women. And that women also have different experiences from men when it comes to their experiences of substance use. So we talk about some of those unique differences for many reasons. One, so that we can just better understand and meet people where they are. Two, because we can then understand how the systems that are meant to help people with substance use related needs and goals are not normally built with women in mind. They're not necessarily gender specific or gender responsive. And so when we can understand some of the unique experiences of women who use substances, we can also start to understand some of the unique barriers that women face and how all of those barriers are then also leveraged within a pattern of power and control in order to isolate and abuse women. Which brings us to substance use coercion. So, while there has been a growing awareness and really decades of research at this point on the mental health and substance use effects that being abused by an intimate partner can have on a survivor, there's still a lot of room to grow in recognizing all the ways that survivors are abused with a pattern of power and control known as substance use coercion. And so we spent some time really unpacking substance use coercion. And something that I will share is that in my experience, I have never met somebody who was being abused by a partner or ex-partner and who used substances who wasn't also being abused through substance use coercion, who wasn't also facing this kind of abuse. And so, we go through some of the data that comes from our center in collaboration with the National Domestic Violence Hotline. We go through some of the other data available through the literature, as well as just what survivors and advocates have shared with us. And then we create a lot of interactive opportunities for, people in the room to just reflect and recognize, how has substance use coercion shown up in our programs? What have been some of the tactics that you have seen at play, right? And so feel free, if there are some that come to mind here, feel free to pop them in the chat. Of course, always while guarding confidentiality. And then we also, provide additional information on some of the most common forms of substance use coercion, recognizing that there are also many, many other forms of substance use coercion that aren't necessarily on this one list. And then together, we craft advocacy responses to substance use coercion. So, some of the things that can be really helpful in this module are coming together in small groups, whether that's at small tables or in breakout rooms. And we offer different ideas for doing this both in person and virtually. And so, tackling some of these questions in small groups and then sharing our ideas with one another and then bringing that together and having that shared out afterwards as a PDF, or if we're all together and we're using big paper and markers, that we take pictures of all of those and then share that out with everyone who attended, so that it's really participatory, and it's, while there is information in the module to share, that it's also equally important that we are working together to generate solutions and ideas and share these ideas together, because ultimately that's where the magic happens, right? And then some other pieces in this first part of the module also include how to open conversations around substance use coercion. Sometimes there can be this adoption of a medical model around substance use, which can have its benefits, although it can have its downsides as well. But it can have its benefits. But one part of the medical model that really isn't effective in advocacy programs is the idea of screening. How do we screen people for substance use? And that is not the approach in this module, and that's really not aligned with an advocacy approach. So here what we're talking about is how to really set the stage for even being people feeling safe enough to have conversations around substance use and substance use coercion. And how do we open up some conversations? And then how do we respond? Responding with validation and affirmation. And then from there, supporting safety, coping, and access to desired resources. And then how to share information in ways that are rooted in consent, that are non-coercive. So that's the first section of the module. Now, the second section of the module focuses more on substance use and what is often called recovery. Now, recovery itself, we want to be aware, is a word that is not culturally universal, right? Actually, there's been some really interesting research done that the vast majority of people who experience any kind of, risk related to substance use tends to resolve that risk without ever coming into contact with a formal substance use support provider and doesn't identify as being in recovery. And so recovery can be a really, really powerful word for some people. It can feel really important for some people. And for other people, it just might not be a relevant term at all. And other people might describe their experience in a totally different way. Might describe it as healing, might describe it as just getting healthy, might not even have a certain way that they refer to it because it was something that they have undertaken as just a kind of just a just kind of like a instinctual part of their experience of their life, right? It might not be something that someone feels the need to even label in their own life. But So with that in mind, with all of that in mind, that whenever we use the term recovery, we mean that in the broadest of senses, that people define their own recovery, and that even the word itself might not be something that is really meaningful or relevant for somebody. So within this section, um, we focus on the relationships that people can have with substances and the vast spectrum, variety, diversity of ways that people can interrelate with substances. And that we want to really pull away from any kind of all or nothing thinking that all substance use is dangerous or risky or must mean that someone has a diagnosable substance related condition, and that we want to be able to have a lot more of just openness and holistic views around substance use that is also much more reality based because there have been multiple national surveys and reports done here in the US as well as globally that have shown that the vast majority of people who use alcohol and other substances do so in ways that do not meet criteria for a substance related disorder and do not pose a risk to themselves or others, right? So, this is where we want to start to really pull apart from kind of all or nothing thinking around substance use so that we can have a much more realistic, much more survivor centered, and ultimately just much more helpful view around it. And as we move away from all or nothing thinking around substances, this framework is exceptionally helpful in really unpacking what are some of the unique experiences around substance use that this person has. And so this framework is called the drug setting framework. And, so here in the module, we learn about each of these kind of parts of substance use experiences, and then we practice. So understanding that, the drug, the substance. So this has a huge part on our substance use experience. This is talking about the substance itself. So for example, if I'm using cannabis versus alcohol, or both of them together, that is going to result in very different experiences. The route of administration, so how we get the substance in our body, right? So if a substance is eaten versus smoked, let's say, that tends to be absorbed in different ways by our body. That tends to result in really, different effects. How much we use. Here I often think about, if somebody has one beer versus 12 beers, they have a very different experience of that alcohol use, right? And then ultimately, this part is talking about the way that the substance impacts us. The physiological and the neurological, how it affects our body, including our brain. Then from there, moving to set. Set is talking about everything that is happening kind of inside of our mindset and our bodies. So outside of what's in the drug category. So this is our mindset before use. My experience of substance use is going to be different if I am using substances out of, to cope with feelings of guilt or anger or shame or fear, right? Versus if I am in a celebratory mindset, right? So the mindset has a huge role in our substance use experience, as well as any physical health conditions we may have, whether we've eaten that day, kind of our nutrition, our relationship with food and access to nutrition, as well as comfort foods. And then our own personal cultural attitudes about use. Is this use something that is seen as normalized or beneficial within my culture? Is this seen as really, deviant in my culture? And that's just kind of really, really really making that shame and that guilt much more potent. And we know that shame and guilt tend to drive really negative substance use experiences. So being aware of how shame and guilt are interacting with substance use and helping to neutralize and heal that shame and that guilt. And then the setting. So this is everything outside of us. This is outside of the person using substances. So this is the environmental factors that are around use. So like the time of day that substances are used, where they're used, how they're obtained, where they're kept. What's the social context of use? What, is it in the context of a cultural ritual, or is it in the context of trying to, fall asleep in a shelter, right? Like, what is the social context? And does it need to be hidden? As well as larger sociocultural factors, how one substance use is viewed in the larger, whether it is friends and family, programmatic community, if someone is residing in a program, as well as just a larger community. Here, keeping in mind that when people don't have safe, stable spaces in which to use, that really drives negative experiences and harmful and risky experiences related to substances as well. And so inviting folks to take a moment and just think about, how does this show up in that situation that you identified earlier? What were the drug or drugs at play and how they were used? What was some of the the mindset, the physical health, the cultural attitudes around use, expectations around use? And then what were some of the environmental factors? For example, for folks who may be working in a residential setting, which I worked in residential settings for over a decade, and I'm so passionate about what that looks like when we work where someone else lives, right? And the way that we can really be present with folks when we're together in these ways. Um, that when someone has entered a residential program, that there's been a huge change in their setting right then and there. So there may be someone who's sharing with us, they may be experiencing some, experiences in their substance use that may be really new. Maybe, they're becoming more intoxicated than they normally do when, they've used and not been in this new setting. Maybe they're feeling more nervous or anxious, and that is resulting in a more negative substance use experience. So when we're in a residential setting, just even thinking about the different environmental factors, especially when there's been a big change, someone is new and someone is kind of getting used to being in this new setting, which many of the settings, unfortunately, are very short term. So there's not even a real like getting used to it, right? It's so incredibly temporary sometimes, which is also can feel really destabilizing for folks. And then within this module, also unpacking what is recovery? What do we even mean when we say recovery? What is recovery about? And through this, we always, there's so many different pictures and images and ideas that get shared. And what you picture in your mind when you think of recovery is probably pretty different than the other, 100+ people on this session right now, right? There might be some overlap, but there's also some unique points. And what's really beautiful is that as we envision this together, something that we can find in those commonalities is that recovery is not about power and control. Recovery is not about power and control. Mm-mm. So, from that segment, we move into the practical strategies for supporting survivors. And here, um, the framework that we use is stages of change, and being able to use stages of change to both get a better sense of where people may be in relation to their substance use in that moment, and then to inform what kinds of supports might actually feel supportive, right? Um, that we don't want to show up with ways that end up making people feel just invalidated or not heard, or that we're trying to control them, right? So here are the stages of change. And so we have, um, in pre-contemplation, there is really not seeing any problems with their substance use. And something that I want to be really, really clear about here is that there are a lot of people who use substances in this world who don't experience problems in relation to their substance use. So if somebody is letting us know, no, I don't see any problems around this, that doesn't automatically mean that they're in pre-contemplation, right? They might not be anywhere on this stage of change, or they might be in a maintenance phase where they're just keeping up what works for them, right? So pre-contemplation is, there's no problem here. Um, and people can feel very kind of coerced if people start talking to them about change or that there's some kind of problem, right? Rightfully so. Contemplation, people start wondering, is this a problem? Is there something that maybe I'd like to see differently about my relationship with substances? Preparation is where someone has made a decision that they want to change some aspect of their relationship with substances. It may not be stopping substance use. It may be using in ways that are safer, right? And this is something that is really important for us to be prepared to support people with. Just the same way that we wouldn't really be able to help many people if we just said, well, you have to leave that relationship and come see me when you do, because otherwise there's nothing I can do to help you, right? That wouldn't be helpful. And actually, it would be harmful, right? There'd be a lot of people with increased risks and dangers not getting the access to the safety planning and advocacy and resources that they want and need and frankly deserve. So it's the same parallel here with substance use. Then in action, people are starting to take some steps, kind of put some of the thoughts of what they might want to change into action. And in action, we can think about kind of short-term changes, right? That we're experimenting, we're seeing what works, we're refining our plan. And then maintenance, we've kind of figured out in some ways what works for us. And now we're going into more of that kind of new normal phase. And so thinking about that situation that you identified earlier, what stage of change do you think that person was most likely in at that moment, right? Think about that. And then we want to meet people where they are. Too often, our services in domestic violence and substance use, really in any field where people who use substances end up in, our services are really tend to overly focus on the action phase of change. People who are taking steps to change their substance use somehow. When anywhere from 85 to 90% of people who use substances are actually in pre-contemplation or contemplation. And this mismatch, what it means a lot of the time is that people then aren't able to access services that are truly helpful, right? So going back to that situation, what stage of change were you in that moment? Take a moment to reflect. Were you really meeting the person where they were in that moment? Or were you in a different place? or you may be in a place where you were trying to plan for change or actually engage in some of that change. When we have this mismatch and we kind of don't meet people where they are, it leads to not only ineffective services and supports, but it also can lead to a lot of discord in our relationships. Because understandably, people end up feeling not heard, judged, or like we're just the next source of control. And what's really beautiful is that as advocates, we practice harm reduction every day. Every day we partner with survivors to support their well-being, their safety. Every day we suspend judgment as well as manage our own fear around someone's safety. Safety planning is a harm reduction practice. And the module has a lot of different resources for applying what we do every day in safety planning to the relationship with substances, as well as how that intersects with the domestic and sexual violence they may be facing and the substance use coercion. So I'm recognizing that, an hour goes by quickly. So I am going to kind of just lightly touch on a few different things and make sure that we leave time for questions at the end. So here we talk about many pathways to recovery. There's a lot of ways that people engage in making changes around their substance use, and the module has different additional information and resources on so many of the different ways that people engage in making changes around their substance use if they choose to make any changes around their substance use. And understanding that the ways that people approach their relationship with substances is is very influenced by culture, by social identity, and our positionality, what we even have access to based on our positionality and our intersectionality. And then we also talk about recovery capital. So while we're real clear that power and control do not produce recovery, that turning people away does not produce recovery, we want to think about what are some of the internal and external resources that people commonly access as they heal and as they engage in their recovery journey. And so, what we do with Recovery Capital is that we work together to identify the ways that we are already supporting Recovery Capital. And then we also come up with ideas and share tips on some additional things that we could do that we could start doing right away, that we could start doing without a whole ton of new resources. And usually people come away with a lot of new ideas, as well as, exchanging resources and different models, right? Maybe exchanging a policy or exchanging some different community resources right there in the room. And then, this list is not comprehensive. There are a lot of different sources of recovery capital that aren't necessarily reflected here. And so we can also spend some time brainstorming together and talking about. And one of my favorite questions is what are some of those cultural resources in recovery and healing that maybe aren't on this list, reflecting on your own culture and communities, right? Not speaking for somebody else's culture or community, but reflecting on our own culture and community. So in my last few minutes, gonna just give a taste of some of the policy pieces, because the last thing we want is advocates coming away and saying, I want to do all this stuff. I want to show up with people. I want to be present with people. And then the policy environment and the program is still one that is controlling or punishing towards survivors who use substances. And then advocates just can't even put into practice the things that we're talking about. And there's just all this continued danger and risk in the program because survivors aren't free to talk about what's actually happening with them. So something that we really want to be aware of is that, programs that that are supportive of survivors who use substances, there's not higher rates of substance use in their program. It's not like people are like, oh, great, I can use drugs. I'm going to use drugs because the program doesn't tell me I can't. No, 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 no. Like, that is not what happens. What happens is that people very often are already in the program and use substances, but don't have the benefit of being able to talk with people about it, to safety plan around it, to get support around it. And that increases risk for everyone, right? Whatever we can't talk about and safety plan around is going to potentially increase risk. So, going back to that reflective practice, always centering our values and really rooting ourselves in the realities of why might survivors who use substances hesitate to access our support, right? And what happens to survivors and their children and other family members if they're not allowed in our program or if they're kicked out of our program because of substance use? What happens, right? What happens? And how is stigma against people who use substances showing up in our services? What can we do to really deepen our anti-oppressive practice? So these are reflective questions that we can use on our own, we can use in team meetings, we can use as part of the training. There's so many different ways that we can engage in this. Then we talk about how do we build safety for survivors to be able to discuss substance use with us. It's not about asking the right question on your intake when it comes to substance use. It's about building safety so that people feel comfortable talking with us about substance use. When people get the sense, that felt sense of safety, that you're not going to judge me, I'm not going to get kicked out, you're not going to tell me I just have to go to treatment, right? And that you might actually be supportive and helpful about this. People often can't wait to tell us kind of what's going on, right? And get that support. So our focus isn't on asking the intake question. Our focus is on building that safety for survivors to have real talk with us. And that so much of that involves being able to come alongside, right? Being able to shift from any kind of rule enforcement to coming alongside as an ally, as a supportive collaborator. And a lot of this maps right onto low barrier services and voluntary services, right? And then this section also talks about stopping the use of any kind of toxicology screening, whether that's urine screening or breathalyzers or anything like that, and kind of what to do instead, right? How that's not helpful and what to do instead. Um, Supporting parents and children, and then some additional tips around supporting program safety. And I see y'all in the chat. Oh, you make my heart so glad. Thank you, thank you. And then our final section, so start getting your questions queued up because I'm going to be sure to save some time for questions. So on preventing and responding to overdose. So here we talk about, there's some data on overdose trends, which are tragic and horrifying. And then we talk about what are some tried and true ways for preventing unnecessary loss. And so we give some, information on things like medication-assisted treatment, naloxone distribution and use, and a little bit on overdose prevention centers. We talk about overdose risk factors. Some risk factors are related to social conditions, as well as domestic and sexual violence, health status, community context, as well as things that are related to somebody's pattern of use. We also talk about recognizing and responding to potential opioid overdose, including, what is some trauma-informed follow-up, understanding for the person who has been revived, as well as the person who has helped, who has reversed that overdose, how to offer some ongoing support. And then key steps, which always is going to come down to building those trustworthy relationships. And then additional information that is specific to preventing overdose due to both stimulants as well as opioids. Understanding that there's also an increasing alarming rates of fatalities due to stimulant overdose. So here is our link for accessing our core curriculum. So this is the direct link to a folder where you can download these contents. This folder is also linked on our ACRTI website, and Carla's going to be putting links in the chat as well. And what you'll find in this folder is the full PowerPoint slide decks for all the modules, handouts, as well as training outlines and guides, both written guides as well as video guides. And so now I'm just going to open it up for any questions that have come up. And of course, as you dig into the core curriculum and start facilitating it in your own communities as other questions come up, please feel free to reach out to us. We are here to support you as you provide, this kind of support in your communities. Okay, I see a question here. Oh, yes, not a question, but a comment. So true, so true. Absolutely, Shannon, thank you. So as folks get ready to put any questions in the chat, I also want to point out just some additional resources we have available on our website. We have a written guide, Committed to Safety for All Survivors, that also has a 5-part webinar series in our webinar library. Oh, here I see a question. Question about toxicology screening. I work in child welfare and foster care, and it seems like that is always the court order for a parent whose kiddos were removed and there's some kind of substance use. If that's not effective, what could the courts do differently? Oh my goodness, what an important question. Thank you for this question. So something, a lot of times a toxicology screening gets court ordered, frankly, because it's a very easy thing to order. But what we need to recognize is that the results of a toxicology screening actually tells us nothing about a person's ability to safely parent or a child's safety or well-being. It tells us absolutely zero about that person's ability to parent or a child's safety or well-being. So what we need to do instead is actually be able to, oh gosh, I'm actually not going to have enough time to get through this whole answer, but in short, what we need to do instead, and this is something that we actually offer dedicated training on as well, is really partner with parents and be able to safety plan around substance use, be able to help parents plan and manage if they are going to use alcohol or another substance. What are the risks that may have happened in the past or may be possible? How can we safety plan around that? Is there, if it is an experience of substance use where the person is not able to safely parent, then what are the social supports that could provide some safe caretaking during that time? There's so much here that can be done instead. And happy to offer more resources on that. I see here also a question of what is naloxone? So naloxone is the opioid antidote, the opioid overdose antidote. also known sometimes by the brand name Narcan. It's this amazing, amazing wonder drug that cannot be abused, cannot harm anyone, and can save lives. So it really should be part of all of our first aid kits, emergency kits. It needs to be as common as a fire extinguisher. I'm also recognizing that I am going to turn it back over to Carla to let us know kind of how we can access some of this information as we wrap up. Thank you so much, everyone. Back to you, Carla.
Thank you, Gabriela, for today's webinar, and thank you everyone for joining today. Once the webinar session is closed, you will be redirected to participate in a survey. Please let us know what worked and and how we did today. Within the next week or so, we will send a follow-up email with a link to today's recording, the slides, all the links that were mentioned during the webinar, and any additional handouts that would be helpful. And of course, all those things will be available on our website as well. You will also receive a certificate of attendance for your time today, and again, the link to the evaluation of today's webinar. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for joining us.